I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about some of the obstacles that many of us are facing when we talk about transitioning to this work from home model. And then from there, Adrian Amos will get into some more technical detail. So the first thing is, obviously we want to talk about the elephant in the room, right? Virtual and remote work has kind of become the reality for us, for most of us on some level. And even within Microsoft, it's been a little bit of a challenge for the people, for example, that are based in Redmond and in some of the larger offices to transition to a completely remote workforce. Getting used to the idea of not being right in front of the people that you work with and collaborate with on a daily basis has been a little bit of a challenge, making sure that you're comfortable with the ideas of being on video and making sure that you've got good quality internet access so that your video isn't pixelated and your voice doesn't sound like a chipmunk and things like that. It's been a little bit of a challenge for some people. For many of us, we work from home on a regular basis and it's not that big a deal. But many of our customers, maybe many of you, are transitioning to this mobile workforce or at least remote workforce model, and it's a challenge. But the tools do exist for us to be successful and to be secure, and that's what this track is dealing with. What are the things that we need to do in order to ensure a secure remote work experience? And we're going to talk about a number of these things as we go through the day. So what are some of the things we need to think about? And this will kind of help you to set some priorities over the next week or two to help make determinations about what are the things that are most important and what are the things that we have to keep track of as we start to enable our workers to work from home. So the first thing, it starts and ends with user identity and access. Protecting user identities is critical. We have to protect the identities of our users and make sure that they have access to the things that they need to access. That's just the starting point. If a user's identity is compromised, then there's a lot of problems. So we have to make sure that we have secure identities, and Adrian's great in talking about that, and so you'll enjoy a lot of the presentations around user identity. Secondly, Dave Totten mentioned during his session the need for multi-factor authentication. So whether you're using something like the Authenticator app or you're using SMS text messages to get your multi-factor authentication, or whatever it is that you're using, securing your user identity with multi-factor authentication is going to be critical, especially in remote work situations. Thirdly, how do we manage devices? I've been speaking with a couple partners over the last couple days, and one of the things that they're scrambling to do is getting devices into the hands of their customers. So the end users want to work from home. They're willing to do that, but you need to have devices that are secured, that have the right applications on them, that are easy to support from a help desk point of view, especially in remote situations. How do you support them remotely? So what are some tools that Microsoft has that allow you to manage your devices in a very methodical and secure way? So there's lots of tools within the enterprise mobility and security tool set that allow you to manage those types of devices. Fourth, your productivity application. So most of us are very familiar with having Exchange in the cloud. Some of us have moved to SharePoint and OneDrive in the cloud. We're using here on this meeting Teams, right? So having these applications available to your end users gives them what they need to at least collaborate together and work together to make sure that they can do the job that they've been hired to do, even if they have to do it remotely. So how do you make sure that everybody has those applications available to them? Having them web-based is one way, but there's other ways that those can be delivered as well. So for example, a Windows virtual desktop or remote apps or things like that. So what are some ways that we can do that? Fifth, meetings and collaboration. We're getting a great example of that right now. Having these meetings over Teams is something that becomes very important, and understanding how to conduct these meetings, as the last question was brought out in Dave Totten's session. How do you bring people together when they're geographically dispersed? How do you make sure that everybody feels included in the conversation when maybe they're not on video, or whatever the situation might be that would make it easy to be overlooked? How do you make sure that that doesn't happen? And how do you collaborate on documentation and make sure that everybody has access to the same information very quickly? Getting on to the sixth point, access to line of business applications. So here we're talking about things that are outside the realm of like your standard cloud applications. So we're not talking about Office 365, we're not talking about Salesforce, but maybe some line of business applications that reside on premise in your data center. How do you give your remote workers access to those line of business applications? So there are tools within Azure AD that will allow you to leverage Azure AD authentication to access those on-premise applications. So how do you make the best use of those? That's also going to require that you have good service monitoring in place for your on-premise applications. Make sure that you're maintaining the uptime, making sure that they're highly available for your end users, so that the outage that you might experience on an on-premise application doesn't negatively impact the overall work stream of your end users. Probably one of the biggest and most challenging issues is the culture and change management that a remote workforce brings along with it. So we really have been sort of thrust into this situation by external forces, and we've just been kind of told, adapt. But from a cultural standpoint, this is a big transition for a lot of companies. Many of them had never allowed remote work. Many of them had never planned on remote work. And now all of a sudden they have to enable this and make it possible. People are used to having that the conversation around the water cooler. How do you facilitate that type of good community interaction when people are widely dispersed? And change management. How do you manage rolling changes to applications like Office 365 and to Azure, where things are continually changing? How do you make sure that you're distributing information about those changes to your end users and giving them enough time to adapt to those changes so that they can stay productive in spite of those changes? And the last one is one that's pretty important to remember, is design scenarios around specific job roles. So for many of us, we are information workers. And so, whoops, let me get rid of that. We're information workers, and so a lot of our tools and the processes that we use are well known to us. We know how to use these applications. We know how to take advantage of the services in Office 365. But what about our first line worker, the people that work in the retail stores, the people maybe in government that are out making sure that the roads are clear, that are making sure that emergency services can get to the people that they need to, where they're not traditional information workers? How do we ensure that they have a voice in the way that jobs are being done, and have a way to communicate back to management and things like that? So think about how the infrastructure that you design and the applications that you distribute, how those impact these other job roles. That's also important. So Those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. That's about all the time I wanted to spend on this. But remember, it is possible to be successful and to be secure in our remote work. There is a new technical community at Microsoft that the link is there. That's called Enabling Remote Work. And in that, you can find ideas from a number of people, whether they're Microsoft partners, Microsoft employees, Microsoft customers, where they're providing ideas about how they're enabling remote work for their end users. So that's all for me. I'll be talking a little bit later today on a couple other topics, but let me pass it over now to Adrian, and we'll get into some of the technical stuff.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate it. Whoa, feedback there. So this morning we're going to be talking about security and compliance controls in the Microsoft 365 space. And David, I'm going to mute you because I was hearing some side tones there. And before I do that, though, actually, David, you brought up a really interesting point, though, about things that we just really never designed to scale for in this sort of scenario. And the one that I'm really curious to hear about, actually, as we kind of move through this, is everybody says, yeah, okay, fine, users can work remote because we have VPN. But as a former infrastructure engineer for several years, I can tell you I never bought a machine large enough to handle the kind of VPN traffic that we're seeing today. And not only did we not buy the right size machines to support it, but just going through radius logs to try to figure out how to secure that environment is going to be a fascinating new imposition on infrastructure engineers and support and security and compliance controls. I'm really curious to see how that's going to scale. And especially right now, not just with people trying to get back into VPN, but also trying to decide, is that even still relevant, right? If the VPN is taxed and all your workloads are in the cloud, maybe we should use the VPN just a little bit less. Anyway, with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my my presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to dig in and see some fun stuff around how to drive security and compliance capabilities in Microsoft 365 space. So as I said, I have been doing this for quite some time, 23 years implementing and securing and managing enterprise environments, including 7 years at DoD. And I actually now, this is beginning my 11th year of supporting Microsoft Cloud Solutions, which sounds completely insane. Over the years, we've seen a massive transition in how security was designed. Right? Years ago, protecting communications was pretty simple. We had our classic castle defense, big walls, limited ingress and egress points. Anything that needed to come in from outside went through very stringent testing. You knew what was on your network. You knew about the VPN, right? Your servers were protected. Maybe you had a DMZ sitting there with a Exchange or a web proxy server, so you can filter out or serve up your Exchange Outlook web access, right? You maybe had some BlackBerry users and potentially maybe even an investment in an intrusion. But then there was a watershed moment, and that moment was when this guy made this one smug smile on stage, right? That moment, January 9th, 2007, changed the world. Every executive suddenly had to have an iPhone. They would meet in the airport lounges and show off and sit there and go, oh, behold my majestic iPhone, right? And it changed everything about the way we had to secure things, because when they came back from the lounge, the first thing they complained about was, I can't get this to my network. I can't get it to the systems that are on premises. So we had to start changing the way that we operated. We had to start opening up ports in our firewalls. We had to start exposing applications to the internet in new ways. In many cases, we had to start enabling cloud services, things that we just weren't ready for as an organization. And now, as a result of that transition, we see where data lives, it travels everywhere. Users go out and they provision their own services. They travel around the world. They connect with their iPhone, their iPad, their tablets, their this, that, and the other. They have everything, right? And they're getting to it, and they're enabling services for themselves and telling their friends about what great services they should go out and do. And by the time it comes back to us, our classic castle starts to look a little bit more like this, right? Our data is everywhere. The castle walls are worthless. Gunpowder came to Europe, if you will, and all of a sudden it's all meaningless. So the trick is not just recognizing that that's true, but the trick is also embracing that as the reality. And for years. Even now, we're still seeing a lot of organizations still clinging to that traditional castle defense approach. But it's not just around the security of the content too, right? Because at the same time that the iPhone came into play, and actually it's at the same time, we started to see a massive uptick in the compliance requirements associated with our data around the world. You can actually see right there, that's the moment where it started to tick upright. It's a low, slow transition, and then it's a big kick, right? So now we're not only responsible for making sure the data is secure, but we also have to make sure there's compliance around it. And we have to be able to do that wherever the data is. And I can tell you that if we still had to do this on premises with the old traditional approach, we'd be in a world of hurt. Because in the traditional method of defining our security, defining our compliance approach and all that fun stuff, we would say, okay, here are the subset of things that I can decide that we will meet by the end of this year. And here are some things that'll be nice to have. And the rest of it, there's no budget for that, right? The tools are massively expensive. We're a small organization. It's just not going to be on our radar. And in the early days of cloud adoption, we saw a very similar transition or a very similar approach to security, right? You're going to host your servers in the cloud and it's going to be okay. But what we started to embrace now with true cloud enablement is the shared responsibility model, where Microsoft says, okay, we got all this base layer stuff, right? We're going to secure the physical infrastructure. You worry about your workloads. Well, if we can worry about our workloads more, then we can actually get a lot more done in the security space. And then we can actually bolt on some additional cloud security controls to bridge some of the gaps that we never even thought we'd be able to do and get really intelligent security detection, protection, and response capabilities. And then once they are all using those cloud workloads, we can actually take advantage of the threat intelligence that exists out there to drive improvements in our detection and response times, while also giving us the visibility to say, hey, this is where it started, this is where it ended. We have full root cause analysis, and we can go on and we can feel secure and safe wherever our data might be. But the trick is, there are obviously a million different ways that we can achieve this, right? And we have to be really careful, because what we end up choosing are a bunch of different point solutions that don't really play well together. And so we end up with a lot of very manual intervention, right? So I've got this tower over here around network security. I've got this tower over here around identity management. I've got this tower over here, and they've got these amazing tools, and they are true best-in-class tools, but they don't talk to each other. So we buy this other thing, a SIM, and we get that half deployed, and then we realize that it's extremely difficult to manage. All it really gives us is red light, green light. So we still have a human being monitoring the SIM. We still have a human being monitoring the threat detection tool. We still have a human being monitoring all these things. And we're not really ever able to take advantage of the cloud security and threat intelligence capabilities at scale, unless we start both looking at it from a Microsoft perspective with the 365 approach. The idea here is that we have all of these signals now integrated, all of these the capabilities now chasing from one end to the other, and literally able to do every single thing that's on this screen and drive automated incident response capabilities out of it. So while we're busy trying to figure out how to tie together this point solution, right, the attackers have actually a pretty simple attack kill chain. They're going to start with trying to get into your environment with a simple ingress approach. It's usually going to be a phishing message or a website. Then they're going to transition that to command and control, where they're going to take it over machines, start looking for other exploitations in the environment. They're going to transition that to lateral movement, looking for accounts to eventually find an admin account, and then eventually to exfiltrating data. Our point solutions are great. We can cover all of those things. But again, one tool, we can actually leverage capabilities that exist across the Microsoft 365 space to control all of this. Now, anybody who's done any of my live events in the past, where we actually sit down and have machines going through all of these things, will know that my environment usually has about 10 security dashboards pinned. And if anybody believes that Microsoft doesn't have quite enough security dashboards, I'm right there with you. And apparently they heard the message loud and clear. And so we got another new security dashboard. The nice thing is, though, that this actually is kind of the one to tie them all together. So now in our security.microsoft.com space, we actually are getting threat intelligence and signal data and alerts and incidents and everything driven into this one space from Defender ATP, from Office 365 ATP, even from Azure ATP, from Intune, from all kinds of different places that are happening all together. Cloud App Security is all coming into this one space. So now we can actually alerts and incidents in a reverse timeline and chase through and figure out where things are driving or where we have security challenges in our environment from a single pane of glass. And when we start talking about driving the security model, right, we have to understand that the attackers are always transitioning. They're always changing up their methods. We can never outrun the attackers. We can never outrun the bear, right? The only thing that we can ever do is drive our security posture forward as security models change and attempt to just be slightly faster than the other guy, right? That is the actual goal of security. It's published all over the place. It's a terrible way to look at the world, but the reality is all we can ever hope to do is be slightly faster than the other guy, be a slightly appealing target than the next guy. And the nice thing, though, is that we actually have a tool built right into this space that helps us drive that security posture, and that is SecureScore. And I'm going to dig into SecureScore a little bit, and David touched on it just a tiny bit, I think, or it might have been, well, it was one of the Davids touched on it, so I'm not wrong, that we also have a compliance score capability that exists. And since the two operate so very similarly, I'm actually going to show you a little bit of both and how they can help you drive improvements in your posture around both things. So our SecureScore, again, another new dashboard. We just love driving dashboard adoption. SecureScore and Compliance Score are both going to show you, again, your posture, how you're doing on things. SecureScore is actually looking at the buttons you have clicked in your environment. So have you enabled this security capability? Whereas Compliance Score is going to be driven on compliance controls that you've decided are important to you as an organization. As we get into either one of them, it's going to show you weighted and prioritized actions that you should take right now to drive the largest improvement you can in your score, generally for the lowest cost, whether that cost is implementation cost or user training cost or however it is we want to perceive that. It's weighting and prioritizing these actions so that we can make big improvements quickly. Both tools have improvement actions that we can dig into. Again, they show the score impact that we'll get, how many points we'll get for doing these sort of things, and whether or not they're done. We can filter these actions down and say, hey, listen, in Q1, I can only actually afford to take on things around identity or things that will drive toward GDPR or whatever. We can filter our list down. Then once we actually get into those, we can decide, okay, I want to focus on this one action, right? And I've picked one on each side that generally is equivalent to the other. And what I want to show you here is that as we dig into these, right, we're going to have a very similar experience across these two tool sets. If I do this thing, what is my user impact going to be? How do I do this thing? What is it that I'm trying to achieve? So at a glance on the SecureScore side, it's going to tell me what I'm making better, what protection I'm improving. On the compliance score side, it's going to tell me how that's going to drive my compliance. And in this case, it looks like if I do this one thing, I'm going to get points for both compliance assessments that I care about. I'm going to be able to go into both and edit status and notes. And on the SecureScore side, I actually have a button that takes me directly to the control. So I don't have to keep a map of which controls are in all 1,005 dashboards across the Microsoft space. I can go straight to it, make the change, and within 24 hours, that change will be reflected in my score. And that becomes important because now we can actually see our score over time, how it's transitioning. What are we doing to make things better in our space? And again, for the compliance score too, we have this same ability to look at what are the assessments that I'm driving toward. And I have a button right here that I can actually click and go to make additional assessments available in my environment and drive the scores based on those. And again, I mentioned that the goal is never to outrun the bear. We can't do that. So we actually do have the ability to see how am I doing compared to the other guy? And we can drive that comparison based on our industry sector, the licenses even that we have to bring to bear to this, organization size, and our geographic region. So does anybody have any questions? I want to take just a hot second here. I know I'm going through a ton of stuff, but does anybody have any questions? If you want to come off mute, welcome to address anything right here. Before we jump into the next section. And Christina, I'll point out, I can't see the chat, so if you're seeing anything, just go ahead and come off mute and let me know.
Yeah, nope, so far.
All right.
Not seeing anything.
Okay, cool. So since this is such compelling information, let's talk about Compliance Manager for just a hot second, right? This is actually what drives the metrics that we're going to be assessing in Compliance Score. So Compliance Manager, we make the change that we decide the assessments, Compliance Score reflects it. When we want to go in and add an assessment, it's just as simple as clicking Add Assessment. We get the filtering option that shows us all the ones that are available. NIST 800-53 seems to be really popular right now. And I can tell you that if you can actually drive toward 800-53, you're clicking the boxes for 75% of all the capabilities and all the compliance assessments. So if you can get that guy done, that's going to be pretty amazing. But we can also now in Compliance Score download templates of existing compliance assessments and open them up, add our own controls to them, or even create our own template from scratch, add these controls up here. And so now we can say, hey, listen, this isn't really part of CCPA, but I know I got to start with that. And I have these 3 or 4 things that are important to me internally from a compliance assessment perspective. We can add those assessments and those templates and those dimensions, add them in there, and then they will be reflected in our compliance score, and we can report on them too. And then when it comes time for the auditors to come in, we can actually just click on the nice convenient export button, and it pulls down a full list of all of our controls, all the things that we've done, and we can go ship it, and the compliance guys, the auditors, can actually deal with that on their terms. So enough about auditing, right? We want to come back to the compliance score. I mentioned that we have this, or sorry, secure score. I want to come back to this because this is, again, where all of our threat signals are now coming into. And you can see here, I have my active alerts and my active incidents that are going on. And if I click into either one of those spaces, I'm going to be able to see that nice reverse timeline of all the things that are happening, all the things that are being reported in from, again, Office 365, from Defender, from Azure ATP, from Cloud App Security. And you can see right here, I've got some things, some app breaches have been discovered recently. I go around the country and I do this in person, and we actually will do things like running malware on the machine. So you can see where this has happened recently, and have I gone in and closed these alerts. If there are enough alerts that come together, or if the alert is significant enough, it's going to create an automatic incident. Have I gone through and addressed these incidents? And what's really nice and what we have lacked in the past with these reporting tools is what's the actual impacted entity here? Is it just a machine? Is it the user and the machine? Was there a traversal? Do I need to worry about this thing happened and then it dragged in these 4 other machines? So you can see in this case, I've got 5 machines associated here with an EDR challenge. And if I click on that and open that incident up, it's going to take me directly, just like Secure Score did, it's going to take me directly into that actual interface to drive improvements around that security challenge. But since the focus of our conversation today is going to be on Office 365 security, around driving communication security and compliance, we really are going to generally start our discussion in the Office 365 Threat Intelligence Dashboard. Now, the dashboard. Just doing nothing except turning on this tool set. And literally that is all I have ever done until I think the night before last. I had never actually lit up any of the security controls in my demo tenant. And on my behalf, it pulled up investigations. It purports to drive daily efficiency improvements, but it has gone through and deleted content for me. It's identified messages as being malicious, and it's soft deleted. And in this case, what that really means is to put it in quarantine for me as the administrator to go back and assess. It's blocking URLs that are being received by my users. It's reaching back into mailboxes post-delivery and saying, yikes, hold on, the security signal detected that there is malicious content in this message. It was 0 day, it got through, but now the system can actually reach back into those mailboxes and pull that back out as zaps. And you can see right here, I had that 0 day malware come in, but it was also picked up in 59 locations around my demo tenant. We can also see, again, that there was that malware attempt. We've had some advanced phishing attempts detected and blocked. And across the globe, how is the system responding? And incidentally, I'm looking over here because my other monitor's over here. I'm not trying to be weird or anything. So it's doing things even without me going in and clicking any buttons. So literally just having it enabled is driving my security in my environment forward. But there's two really important things that we can do in Office 365, and they're so important that we actually view them as being fundamental to the security of a proper cloud deployment. In fact, so fundamental that if an organization wants to migrate to Exchange Online and they are not interested in doing Office 365 ATP, we're going to make you sign a waiver saying you accept the risk, because this is so critical. And that is, we can stop the vast majority of the ingress portion of the attack kill chain simply by enabling safe attachments and safe link filters. And what this does, this gives us the ability to recognize and detonate in a sandbox unknown files as they are received at our Exchange Online boundary. So user sends in a message, it's got an attachment that's been seen before and known to be good. The Microsoft security graph, which is processing like 7 trillion security signals per day, which is crazy, says, okay, that file has a known good checksum, throw it in, it's fine. Or a new file comes in and it's not known. Well, we got to detonate that in the sandbox. And the sandbox is fascinating. If I asked you in your environment, I can't do a show of hands, unfortunately, how many of you guys are VMware or hypervisor admins, how quickly you could spin up 30 to 50 VMs, the answer is generally somewhere between a few hours and a few days. But if I then went in and said, okay, well, how quickly could you spin up a VM running every current supported version of Windows 10? Or subversions of that also running every current supported version of Office, and then subversions of that also running every current version of every currently supported browser. Your time to deploy that might go up just a little bit, right? That's actually what's happening in the background when we go to detonate a message in the sandbox. We're getting this massive array of virtual machines. Files, it's opened up. All those machines then are monitored for what they do next. And if a few of them start coming up with spurious behavior, then that starts to raise the threat signal on that file. The file then gets written into the security graph as saying, new alert, this is coming up, and the user then might not get the delivery of the attachment. So while that's happening, the user is sitting there patiently waiting for their message to be delivered. And then we get to make some choices. How do we want to notify the user that your message is real and you should expect it to be delivered very soon, but just be patient? We can decide that we want to just be crazy people and fly close to the sun, no scanning of any sort. We can continue to monitor the message. We can block recipients from getting messages. But what we typically see folks doing is choosing dynamic delivery. So the message, the text of the message is received by the user while they have a placeholder attachment that says ATP scan in progress. And generally, the amount of time it takes to do that scan for most Office type files is about 2 minutes. And that's spinning up all these VMs, running all these security scans on them, writing that data to the Microsoft graph, making an assessment of whether or not to deliver it to the user, and then doing that delivery, generally about 2 minutes. With safe links, but safe links actually works not just at the time of delivery, it works at the entire time that the link is anywhere in our environment. So it's writing basically a proxy filter, proxy URL around it. And now whenever a user clicks on a message that is received, it's actually going to go and reassess that URL over and over and over again. So let's say you've had a really bad day and I send you a GIF from the internet of the cat hanging from the tree that says hang in there. And you're like, okay, wow, that's kind of nice. Except instead of sending you the actual GIF link, I send it to you as a bit.ly. So you have to click on it to go see what's there. Tomorrow you're feeling better, but now your buddy's out of the office and he's sick. And you're like, I'm gonna just send him that GIF. I'm gonna send him that bit.ly image. That was nice. Made me feel a little better. So you send the bit.ly. Only now on the back end, I've changed where that goes to badguycredentialharvester.com. Your buddy's at home sick. He is not thinking about network security. He's thinking about check this email. He clicks on the link, and now it's asking him to log in. You have now phished your coworkers for me, and we need to be able to make sure that we're protecting against that. With safe links, we're doing actually the same level of scanning against links that we were doing against attachments, with the virtual machines spinning up, checking out what happens when the users go to these sites. If it's a known good URL, they get right in. If it's a known bad, they get a Windows Smart Screen alert. And if it's somewhere in between, you might get that yellow warning page that says, please wait while we assess this page. And again, these are persistent security controls that can travel with the link even when it's embedded in Office 365 applications. And yes, we can actually click the crazy button here that says go ahead and let them through anyway, because sometimes it's fun to fly close to the sun. Or actually, sometimes we have R&D people who really are trying to make sure that things are working properly. But we can also get some of these controls filtered back to us, not just from Office 365 ATP, but also leveraging the built-in controls that are in Windows 10 and driving those controls through management interfaces like Intune, or reporting on these controls through Windows or Microsoft Defender ATP, still getting used to that new branding. We can decide that Windows 10 should pre-filter websites and say, hey, this is a known malicious location. And again, it's pulling from that same security graph, that same 7 trillion security signals daily to assess and protect things that are happening at Microsoft Edge. And when we go there, yeah, we're going to see a big, nasty red message. And again, I'm driving this environment strictly from Intune. And I'm going to stop for just one hot second here and say that while we're talking about security communications, in my demo tenant, I have literally no infrastructure. Everything I am doing to drive the security, the productivity, and everything in my entire demo tenant is driven from Intune. And that means pulling the machines out of the box to sticking an image on them to fully deploying them. I have 2 touches: put the Windows 10 image or USB stick in the machine and log in. Intune does the rest. So I'm driving all of this baseline security, all the controls directly out of that, and rolling it into Defender ATP, getting all these security signals, and even setting up Outlook and OneDrive and all that stuff purely from cloud infrastructure. So now I've got my Intune policy saying, make sure that Smart Screen is turned on. And if Smart Screen lets it go, then I've got safe links backing that up. And then if that gets bypassed somehow, I've got Defender ATP watching from an EDR perspective to make sure that if the user goes somewhere bad, we have protections in depth to make sure that nothing happens as a result of that bad click. Now, the other side of talking about securing communications tends to be focused around DLP, or data loss prevention. And depending on who you're talking to, DLP can mean a lot of different things, right? It can mean making sure that financial data isn't slipped out into the world. It can mean making sure specific file types aren't dropped out into the world. It can mean making sure that when I download a file from OneDrive, I'm not able to copy it over to my Gmail. And it can actually even mean, in terms of automation, ensuring that our automations aren't capable of taking business sensitive data from one interface and sliding it over into another programmatically. And we actually have controls to help protect against all those different types of DLP. Now, the most common conversation then is going to be around Office 365 DLP capabilities and driving to make sure that we're not losing things like credit card numbers. So conveniently, the Office 365 component is baked into the same compliance master dashboard that we saw earlier. So we can see DLP frameworks and how they're operating. If we want to drive or add a new policy for our DLP environment, we can simply start with templates that are pre-baked in. We can isolate down to the geographic region that we want to, and it's going to then filter and show us things that are probably going to be contextually relevant to that region. Protected information types then are protected in these areas, and I might decide that I want to go in really granularly and decide to exclude a couple distribution groups, make sure that I'm not monitoring OneDrive. Maybe we haven't adopted that yet. I'm watching Teams chats and messages, but maybe I've got a legal team that I can't do things around DLP. Maybe they have to transition data out between themselves and a partner organization. And we're also then able to decide what rules to drive as a result of those policy detections. So we have all of these sensitive information types that are built into the policy. We want to restrict access to the content and notify and give users policy and mail tips when they try to do things. These are going to be based, again, these sensitive information types are extremely complicated. They're looking at text filters, patterns, proximity behaviors, looking at checksum values. If you've ever tried to figure out how to block credit card information, there's a whole huge document out on docs.microsoft.com that explains how that protection is calculated. But it actually works really well. So I actually went into my demo environment a couple nights ago. I guess it was actually last week, Friday the 13th, and logged in as Megan Bowen and tried to send a whole bunch of fake credit card numbers. Now, these credit card numbers are actually, they pass the Loon checksum. So these are real, actual test credit card numbers pulled from a website. If you try to go in and do 1111 repeating, it's going to go through because that doesn't actually meet the checksum requirement to detect a valid credit card number. So in this case, I pulled real, actual test data, dumped it into an email, tried to send it to other people inside the organization, and it blocked it, right? Super simple. The message came up, told me it conflicted with a policy. I see what's going on. It works. It works very reliably. But we also need to be able to know that our data is safe in our third-party cloud applications, or even making sure that, like I said earlier, that we're not sharing file types. So cloud app security then gives us behavioral analytics while also assessing for particular data attributes to control the risk. And then we can also drive that to take corrective actions automatically for us. In this case, what I did was I was concerned that people in the organization were all working from home. We're going to start opening up our work machines. We're going to start going to websites that maybe we didn't go to before. And maybe I'm concerned that risky apps will start exposing my corporate data to the internet. So I built a very simple policy that said, hey, if 5 or more users in my very small environment start going to a website that's not considered particularly safe, and they start downloading more than 20 megs of data, I want to get an alert on that. I want to know, is this a trending application? And if it's an unsafe one, then I want to actually take some specific behaviors. I want to go and mark this website as unsanctioned. And you can see I actually do have a triggered alert on that. I pulled all the machines out of my box, I fired them up, I sent them to this one poor website, Orium.com. If anybody here is from Orium.com, I terribly apologize. This is only affecting my environment. I don't know why you're listed as a low safety or high risk space, but by simply choosing to unsanction that application, Cloud App Security wrote a rule into my Defender ATP environment that then drives blocking against Windows 10 devices as a custom indicator of compromise. So now, within 15 to 20 minutes of that risky app starting to become popular in the environment, I had a block rule in Defender ATP, and I literally, from those machines, can no longer go to that website. It is actually blocked. And if my users try to go there, then they come up as being a high severity risk, and I then can drive additional compliance controls and conditional access requirements based on the fact that the machine is now considered to be at risk. And the way that looks in Defender ATP is, again, I have these custom indicators of compromise defined. My actions here are going to be to alert me and block the website. And then I'm going to be able to see that, yes, truly, the rule did come from Cloud App Security. And it's going to generate, the alert is high severity, but it's going to send the machine into a medium severity. And it's all done for me. It truly is automatically happening. But then we can also drive file type associations, true DLP capabilities that we've traditionally had challenges doing in the Office 365 space out of Cloud App Security. So in this particular case, I created a test policy that, or for an organization that was concerned they might have ITAR content hosted in drawing or AutoCAD documents. So I built a really simple policy that said the 4 most common AutoCAD document file types, and yes, there are more, we want to just block those from being saved in OneDrive for Business. Now, I also have a folder redirection policy that says any file on the desktop automatically goes to OneDrive for Business. So I just dropped these files on the desktop with these extensions. They were matched. They were detected when they got moved over to OneDrive. The DLP Policy engine detected the files and deleted them. Super simple. And it did. It worked exactly as expected. The other challenge that we can get into, though, sometimes with cloud adoption is how do we know where our users are actually sharing our data? Do we truly have the control over our digital estate the way that we would very much like to? And the challenge that we can get into sometimes, and again, especially in this remote work model, is that users can start sharing content very easily, right? OneDrive gives the ability to send a link to a file. SharePoint gives the ability to send a link to a file. We can invite people into our teams. We can do all sorts of stuff. The authority on their own behalf, on your organization's behalf, to extend file sharing scenarios in ways that we maybe just weren't quite ready for. So I have this ability to do a quick access level search in Cloud App Security across my entire digital estate. Are there any files that are shared publicly with just a published URL? And it turns out in my organization there are. Yes?
Hey, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Well, we're coming on time, and you've got a couple of questions.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So, Melinda, do you want to share your screen and ask your question, or I can read it for you? I don't know if she can hear me. Well, she was wondering how, I think you were going over Compliance Manager, and she was wondering how it worked in the GCC space. Excuse me.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
Okay, so
I'm trying to figure out the unmute.
So actually, I'm not 100% sure in the GCC space if Compliance Manager is live yet. There's a constantly updated web or page in docs.microsoft.com that covers all the capabilities that exist in GCC and GCC High and actually straight up DoD. So I can get you that information. I can get you the URL. I monitor it pretty regularly, but I'm not sure about Compliance Manager because I think it is still, even in my tenant, still in preview. So I would assume that it's not there yet for GCC.
Is there Adrian, something that'd be comparable, or is it just completely just being worked on?
Well, I believe you have Compliance Manager. Okay, go ahead. Who's talking?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is Dan Finn. I just dropped into the notes the link to the tech community. So it does look like Office 365 GCC customers have Compliance Manager. They just make a note, because you can upload documents as part of that feature. That storage of document upload is only compliant with Office 365 Tier C, which is probably a lower level than GCC may recommend. So it goes through a couple of the caveats there, but it does look like it's available.
Yeah, and that's Compliance Manager.
Correct.
Yeah. No, you can do all the
it's
same
not yet
stuff
available in GCC High.
Gotcha. That's what I expected.
This is Ro. We do have access to some GCC High technical resources within Microsoft. We've set up a few calls pretty recently with some customers that are in GCC High. So we can definitely connect you with someone who specializes in that space from Microsoft to get some of the questions answered.
Great.
All right, that sounds good.
Great. And then Chapter, Cham, he asked a question. David kind of answered already, but Chapter, do you want to ask Adrian? He's in here. Where is he? Okay, well, he was wondering, how do you deal with false positives on threats, and how do you reduce wrong diverts into threat quarantine? And David said you can request that any false positives be reviewed by any human and remediated. Adrian, do you have a follow-up?
No, that's really it. I mean, part of what we're trying to achieve by lighting up these advanced security controls is actually reducing some of those false things. So there is some training involved in the system, and the system is actually always learning on our behalf. That said, there are some things that still do filter through, right? I mean, we have a mass mailer that goes out from time to time, and I still get alerted on that because the system that we use is a bolt-on system, and it detects it as a mass volume of phishing content. So there are still some things that we deal with, but we kind of learn those patterns, and they become part of the backscatter.
Yeah, this is John Leonard. I asked that question. I was just wondering how much, if it goes off into the void, or if there's a way that the user can be alerted that you had a number of emails that were quarantined, and can you go look at them to see if they were actually legitimate? That was kind of the focus of my question.
Yes, you can. Yeah, and an administrator will decide for the environment how you want to handle that behavior and how you want to handle those patterns, all the way from daily notification of quarantine to absolutely no notification of quarantine. Let the admin solve it for you. So there's different granular controls about how you want to manage that.
Great, thanks.
Sure, no problem at all. So we are getting very close to the end, which actually is pretty convenient for me because the next couple of slides I have are on a capability that isn't yet live in my demo tenant, so I'm going to go pretty quick through them. And those are around insider risk management. And this actually is all brand new. It was all introduced in the last couple of months. I think it was demoed at Ignite. But again, I don't have it in my environment. So these are actually screen grabs that I pulled from somebody else. So one of the things that we need to be able to do, and we've struggled with in the past, is detect when people are doing things at a massive scale in our environments that maybe they shouldn't be doing. And traditionally, we've used Office 365 and Cloud App Security, and Microsoft has done this too internally, to detect with an 80+% degree of accuracy when when a user is getting ready to quit, because they will do two things: a massive download of content followed by a massive deletion of content. And because we've had these other two reporting interfaces before, and we've had to build the detection kind of manually, we've actually now had that rolled over into this insider risk management. So is a user doing something like getting ready to dump their data to take with them to the next job? Are they potentially putting a project at risk, or are they sending harassing content? These are now pre-baked templates into this insider risk management space. And we can go in and build our policies and build our alerts, and then we can actually start to see how those things are taking effect over time. For this one, we have this one confidentiality process or project, and we're seeing that there are some alerts that need to be generated on. And again, these are actually driven from other places in the Office 365 security compliance framework. But it gets all sorts of fancy charts and bells and whistles and buttons, and we can actually, again, with that 80+% degree of accuracy, see when users are getting ready to expose us to some pretty serious risks. And I can tell you from an IT perspective, my last job that I had before Synergy, way back in '09, I got because the previous admin left his pager on the desk in the middle of the night and never came back. My boss at that position hired me and brought me in and said, I have no idea what snakes you will find in this environment. And it was a lot of challenge trying to figure out what data the previous guy had deleted, how many back doors he left open for himself, all that kind of fun stuff, because we didn't have these kind of capabilities in place looking at suspicious behavior patterns as he was planning to leave. Because I guarantee he did not wake up that evening and say, I'm quitting. He probably had a pretty predictable pattern of information. And the absolute last thing I want to touch on, and this just gets very little addressing in most conversations around security and compliance, is we actually can also do user supervision in this space. My first wife's job, when you get a phone call from Capital One and they'd say this call may be monitored or recorded, that was her. Her job was to listen in on a bunch of the sales calls and hear what make sure that they weren't promising things like free TVs if you bought a credit card, which they were. So we need to be able to monitor what certain people are doing and make decisions based on whether or not it's inbound or outbound communications, and have that information dropped into a supervisory mailbox so other people can review later to make sure that our organization is following its own policies. And that capability is absolutely built into the Office 365 space. And that kind of brings me to the end of it. And I won't dwell on it because I have like less than a minute left. If you have any questions, I'm happy to stick around. Christina, you can moderate them to your heart's content. And I want to thank you again for your time this morning. I know this has been kind of a crazy way to do things.